Between September 1940 and May 1941, German bombers ruled the night skies over Britain with near impunity. The Luftwaffe's nocturnal campaign, known as the Blitz, subjected British cities to relentless bombardment under cover of darkness. Night after night, hundreds of Heinkel He-111s, Dornier Do-17s, and Junkers Ju-88s droned across the English Channel, their crews confident that the blackness provided near-perfect protection from British defences. The psychological impact on British civilians was devastating. People huddled in shelters as bombs rained down, never knowing where the next explosion would strike. The sound of air raid sirens became the soundtrack of British life, and the orange glow of burning buildings illuminated the night sky over London, Coventry, Liverpool, and dozens of other cities. For German bomber crews, these missions felt almost routine. Fly to the target, drop the bombs, return home. The darkness was their shield. For the Luftwaffe commanders planning these operations, the calculus seemed simple and favourable. British fighters were essentially blind at night, reliant on pure chance or occasional illumination from searchlights to locate their targets. Even when a night fighter managed to stumble upon a bomber, the engagement usually ended inconclusively, with the German aircraft disappearing back into protective darkness. Anti-aircraft fire was largely ineffective, with gunners firing blindly at engine sounds. The losses Germany sustained during night operations were minimal, mostly from accidents, mechanical failures, or the rare lucky shot. Loss rates hovered around 1 to 2%, considered acceptable for the strategic results achieved. The tonnage of bombs dropped on British cities was staggering, and the damage to industrial capacity and civilian morale seemed worth the modest cost. The night, it seemed, belonged to Germany, and no amount of British determination could change that fundamental reality. German aircrews spoke confidently about their missions, some even growing complacent about the minimal defensive response they encountered. The Luftwaffe's night bombing campaign appeared sustainable and effective, a strategic tool that could gradually wear down British resistance. But beneath the surface, a technological revolution was taking shape that would completely reverse this equation and transform the hunters into the hunted. The frustration felt by British defenders during the early Blitz was palpable and profound. Fighter command squadrons, which had performed so brilliantly during the daylight battle of Britain just months earlier, found themselves virtually impotent after sunset. Brave pilots took off into the darkness on patrol, flying predetermined patterns over cities and hoping, often futilely, to spot the silhouette of a German bomber against clouds or moonlight. The few successful interceptions that occurred were matters of extraordinary luck rather than systematic capability. A pilot might catch a glimpse of exhaust flames, or spot a bomber's dark shape against a lighter patch of sky. Most pilots returned from their patrols having seen nothing but darkness, while below them, cities burned from German bombs dropped with impunity. The success rate was abysmal. Sometimes dozens of sorties would be flown for a single inconclusive contact with the enemy. Ground-based defenses were equally ineffective against the night raiders. Searchlight batteries swept the sky in coordinated patterns, their beams occasionally catching a bomber in their brilliant light. But even when illuminated, the aircraft were usually too high or moved too quickly for anti-aircraft guns to track effectively. The coordination required between searchlight crews and gunners was extremely difficult to achieve in the chaos of a night raid. The gunners fired thousands of shells into the night sky, creating spectacular pyrotechnic displays that did more for civilian morale than actual defense. In reality, very few aircraft were downed by anti-aircraft fire. Some nights, more damage was done to British cities by falling shrapnel from their own anti-aircraft shells than by German bombs. The expenditure of ammunition was enormous, the results minimal. The British public, stoic though they were, couldn't help but wonder how long they could endure this nightly terror. Military commanders knew the situation was unsustainable. Bomber losses had to increase dramatically, or civilian morale might eventually crack under the relentless pressure. Fighter command desperately needed a technological edge, something that would allow its defenders to see in the darkness and turn the tables on the Luftwaffe. Without such a breakthrough, the night would remain Germany's domain, and Britain's cities would continue to burn. The solution to Britain's night defense problem had actually been in development since the mid-1930s, long before the first bombs fell on London. At a secretive research facility at Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast, British scientists had been pioneering a revolutionary technology, radio direction finding, or RDF, which would later become known by its American name, radar. The concept was elegant in its simplicity. Radio waves could be transmitted toward an aircraft, and the returning echoes could reveal the target's location, altitude, and heading. Led by researchers like Robert Watt, the team at Bawdsey conducted experiments that proved radio waves could detect aircraft at considerable distances. By 1938, they had demonstrated the technology's viability, and the British government, recognizing its potential, invested heavily in its development. By the outbreak of war in 1939, Britain had begun erecting a chain of radar stations along its coast, the Chain Home system, that would provide early warning of incoming raids. These ground-based radar stations proved their worth during the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940. Fighter Command could now see German formations building up over France and could scramble fighters to intercept them with unprecedented efficiency. Rather than flying standing patrols that exhausted pilots and aircraft, British fighters could wait on the ground until radar detected incoming raids, then take off and be vectored to the right altitude and position for interception. This capability was one of the key factors in Britain's victory during the daylight battle. But ground-based radar, revolutionary though it was, had significant limitations for night defense. It could detect aircraft at long range and provide general vectors to guide fighters into the right area, but it couldn't guide a fighter directly to its target for the final interception. The resolution wasn't fine enough, and the radar picture became confused when multiple aircraft were in close proximity. To truly solve the night fighter problem, radar needed to be in the fighters themselves. The solution was obvious but technically daunting. Miniaturize radar equipment enough to fit into an aircraft, giving pilots their own electronic eyes that could peer through darkness and clouds. The engineering challenges were immense. Radar equipment in 1940 was bulky, heavy, and power-hungry. Cramming it into a fighter aircraft while leaving room for crew, weapons, and fuel seemed nearly impossible. Yet British engineers persevered, understanding that whoever mastered airborne interception radar would control the night sky. By late 1940, the pieces were coming together, and a revolution in aerial warfare was about to begin. German intelligence was aware that Britain had developed radar technology. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights had photographed the distinctive chain home towers along the English coast, tall masts that were obviously part of some detection system. Captured documents and interrogated British personnel mentioned radar, and German scientists had been conducting their own radar research for years. Yet despite this knowledge, the German High Command made one of the war's most consequential intelligence failures. They fundamentally misunderstood radar's potential and dismissed its strategic importance. Many senior Luftwaffe officers convinced themselves that radar was merely a crude early warning system, useful perhaps for alerting defenses to incoming raids but not capable of directing precise interceptions. They believed reports from bomber crews that British night fighters still relied primarily on visual detection, which confirmed their preconception that radar was overrated. Some German commanders even argued that the chain home towers were partly a bluff, an intimidation tactic designed to make the Luftwaffe overestimate British capabilities. This dismissal was rooted partly in arrogance and partly in misplaced confidence in Germany's own technological prowess. German radar research, while advanced, hadn't been applied to night fighting as systematically as Britain's. The Luftwaffe had focused its electronic warfare efforts on navigation aids for its bombers, systems like Knickerbane and X-Gerat that used radio beams to guide aircraft to their targets. These were sophisticated systems, and their success may have led German commanders to underestimate what Britain might be achieving in defensive applications. There was also an element of wishful thinking in Germany's assessment. Acknowledging that radar posed a serious threat would have required developing countermeasures, changing tactics, and potentially admitting that the night bombing campaign faced serious obstacles. It was easier to dismiss radar's importance and continue operations as planned. German intelligence reports that suggested radar was becoming more effective were often filed away or explained away rather than acted upon. The consequences of this miscalculation would prove catastrophic. Because German commanders didn't believe radar posed a serious threat, they made no significant effort to develop electronic countermeasures, evasive tactics, or defensive equipment for their bombers. Crews received no training on how to evade radar-directed fighters, because their commanders didn't believe such fighters existed or were effective. When British night fighter successes began to mount in 1941, German intelligence attributed them to spies revealing bomber routes, improved searchlight coordination, better trained pilots, or pure luck, anything but the systematic application of airborne radar technology. This willful blindness meant that when the truth finally became undeniable, Germany was years behind in developing countermeasures, and its bomber crews were paying the price. The Bristol Beaufighter, entering RAF service in late 1940, proved to be the ideal platform for Britain's new airborne radar technology. Originally designed as a heavy fighter and torpedo bomber, the Beaufighter had a spacious fuselage that could accommodate the bulky AI, airborne interception, Mk4 radar equipment and, crucially, a second crew member to operate it. This twin-engine aircraft was powered by two Bristol Hercules radial engines, each producing 1,600 horsepower, giving it excellent performance for its size and weight. The Beaufighter was fast enough to catch German bombers, with a top speed of around 330 miles per hour. It was tough enough to absorb defensive fire from bomber gunners, with a rugged airframe and robust construction. Most importantly, it was heavily armed, for 20mm Hispano cannons concentrated in the lower fuselage, plus 6.303 Browning machine guns in the wings. This devastating firepower meant that once a Beaufighter got into firing position, the engagement usually ended quickly and decisively. When the radar set was added, along with its cathode ray tube displays, control equipment, and associated wiring, the Beaufighter became the world's first truly effective radar-equipped night fighter. The AI Mk4 radar could detect aircraft at ranges up to about 3 miles under ideal conditions, though performance varied considerably depending on altitude, weather, and the target size and aspect. The radar operator sat behind the pilot, surrounded by equipment, working his controls and calling out directions. Operating a radar-equipped Beaufighter required extraordinary teamwork between pilot and radar operator. This was a new kind of flying, one that demanded trust in technology and in one's crewmate. The radar operator would guide the pilot using verbal directions based on the blips appearing on his display screens, calling out range, bearing, and altitude corrections. The pilot, meanwhile, had to fly the aircraft precisely based on these instructions, often in complete darkness or inside clouds, while preparing for the moment when visual contact might be made. The learning curve was steep, and early operations were marked by numerous failures as crews learned to trust their electronic equipment and coordinate their actions. Equipment malfunctions were common. The temperamental early radar sets required constant adjustment and would sometimes fail entirely mid-mission. But gradually, through trial and error, systematic training, and the sharing of lessons learned, British night fighter crews developed techniques that would transform them from blind hunters into deadly predators. The stage was set for a dramatic reversal of fortunes in the night sky. The experience of successfully using airborne radar in combat was unlike anything aviators had encountered before. Radar operators peered into their dimly glowing cathode ray tube displays, watching for the telltale blips that indicated a target aircraft. The early AI Mk4 sets displayed two screens, one showing azimuth, left-right position, and another showing elevation, up-down position. When a target appeared, It would show as a spike or blip on these displays, and the operator had to interpret these signals and translate them into directions for the pilot. The skill required was considerable. Ground returns could clutter the display, especially at lower altitudes where the radar beam hit the earth and created confusing echoes. The operator had to distinguish genuine aircraft echoes from spurious signals, which took practice and judgment. The effective range of about 3 miles sounds substantial, but in a fast-moving night interception, that distance closed quickly. The operator had to work rapidly and precisely, calling out corrections while monitoring the changing picture on his screens. Yet when everything worked correctly, the sensation was almost magical. The ability to see an enemy aircraft through complete darkness, clouds, or fog was revolutionary. Radar operators reported that successful interceptions felt like hunting with supernatural senses. They knew exactly where their prey was even when their eyes told them nothing was there. The radar operator would guide the pilot through a series of turns and altitude changes, watching the range decrease. 2 miles, 1 mile, half a mile. At about 1,000 feet or less, the pilot would typically spot the bomber visually, often just a darker shape against the night sky or the faint blue glow of exhaust flames. This moment required intense concentration and good eyesight. Once visual contact was established, the pilot took over, maneuvering into an attack position while the radar operator confirmed they were still tracking the right target. The final approach was conducted visually, with the pilot easing into position behind and slightly below the bomber, where German defensive gunners had limited fields of fire. The Germans, completely unaware they were being tracked by radar, flew their normal bombing missions with no evasive action. Their first warning of danger was often tracer fire tearing through their aircraft from behind and below. The traditional defensive tactic of keeping a sharp lookout for approaching fighters was useless against an enemy they couldn't see coming. British radar operators learned to guide their pilots into perfect firing positions, approaching from the bomber's blind spots. The Beaufighter's heavy armament meant that most successful intercepts ended within seconds. The bomber either shot down immediately or so badly damaged it couldn't continue its mission. The psychological impact on surviving German crews was profound and terrifying. The night of November 19, 1940, marked a turning point in aerial warfare when Flying Officer John Cunningham and his radar operator, Sergeant John Phillipson, achieved what is considered the first confirmed kill using airborne radar. Their Beaufighter took off from Middle Wallop Airfield in Hampshire as part of the standing night patrols attempting to intercept German raiders. Ground control radar had detected a German bomber approaching the English coast and vectored Cunningham's aircraft toward the general area where an interception might be possible. Phillipson hunched over his radar display screens in the cramped rear compartment, his face illuminated by the green glow of the cathode ray tubes. At about 2 miles range, he picked up a contact, an unusually clear return on his displays that stood out from the background clutter. His pulse quickened as he confirmed it was a genuine aircraft and not a spurious echo. He keyed his intercom and began calling directions to Cunningham. Target ahead, slightly right, same altitude. Steer right 10 degrees. Cunningham eased the Beaufighter into the new heading, trusting his radar operator's guidance completely. This was what they had trained for, but this was their first genuine interception attempt with a clear radar contact. Phillipson continued his running commentary, watching as the range steadily decreased on his displays. Range 1 mile, steady on this heading. Range half mile, target slightly below now, descend gently. The tension in both men was palpable. They were closer to a successful radar intercept than any crew had been before. At about 400 feet range, Cunningham spotted it, the dark silhouette of a Junkers Ju-88 bomber against the lighter sky ahead. The German crew was completely unaware of the Predator closing from behind. Cunningham eased his Beaufighter into the perfect firing position, slightly below and behind the bomber, where its defensive guns couldn't reach him. He steadied his aim, checking his gun sight, his finger tightening on the firing button. The 420mm cannons erupted with a deafening roar, their shells tearing into the Ju-88's fuselage and engines. The German bomber staggered under the impact, pieces flying off its airframe. Fire erupted from one engine, then spread rapidly. The Ju-88 rolled over and began its final plunge toward the earth, crashing near Chilham in Kent. There were no survivors. The entire engagement, from first radar contact to flaming wreckage, had lasted just minutes. When Cunningham and Philipson landed and reported their success, the significance was immediately recognized. They had proven that airborne radar could turn night fighting from a game of chance into a systematic hunt. The night would never be the same again. Through the winter of 1940-41 and into the spring, German bomber losses during night operations began to climb steadily and ominously. At first, Luftwaffe commanders attributed the increased losses to various factors: improved British searchlight techniques, unusually favorable weather for visual detection, better trained British pilots getting lucky, or even British spies somehow revealing bomber routes and timing. The truth, that British night fighters were using radar to hunt them systematically, was slow to be accepted by a command structure that had convinced itself radar wasn't a serious threat. Bomber crews returning from missions over Britain brought increasingly disturbing reports. They described being attacked without warning, of British fighters appearing as if from nowhere, guns blazing, then disappearing back into the night. Some crews reported seeing fighters approaching from astern in perfect attack position, as if they had been guided there by some unseen hand. These reports were often dismissed by intelligence officers as exaggerations or misperceptions made under the stress of combat. By the spring of 1941, however, the statistics were undeniable and alarming. Loss rates during night operations had climbed from the acceptable 1 to 2% range to over 4%, and on some particularly disastrous nights, as high as 8 or even 10%. At these rates, the night bombing campaign was becoming unsustainably costly. A bomber crew's chances of completing their required tour of operations were dropping dramatically. The mathematics of survival had shifted against the Luftwaffe. The psychological effect on German bomber crews was devastating and widespread. Pilots and navigators who had felt relatively safe under the cover of darkness now approached British airspace with mounting dread. They knew that invisible hunters might be stalking them at any moment, using some technique or technology they didn't understand and couldn't counter. The casual confidence of the early Blitz evaporated, replaced by fear and foreboding. Morale plummeted as aircraft failed to return and empty bunks multiplied in the crew quarters. Some crews began refusing to fly, citing mechanical problems, illness, or other excuses, the ultimate sign that the balance of terror had fundamentally shifted. Others completed their missions but showed signs of severe stress and combat fatigue. German commanders, finally beginning to accept that British radar was indeed the culprit behind their mounting losses, demanded immediate countermeasures. But their scientists were years behind British developments and had no quick solutions to offer. The night, which had belonged so securely to Germany just months before, was slipping inexorably from their grasp. By the time German military leadership fully acknowledged the effectiveness of British airborne radar, sometime in mid-1941, the technological and tactical gap had become nearly impossible to close. German engineers were ordered to scramble and develop radar warning receivers that would alert bomber crews to British radar emissions, hoping to at least give them some warning that they were being hunted. These devices, when they eventually appeared, were primitive and often produced more false alarms than useful warnings, adding to crew stress rather than alleviating it. More ambitious efforts to fit German bombers with tail-warning radar sets, similar to what the British were using for interception, were begun but ultimately abandoned. The complexity of developing and producing such systems, combined with Germany's deteriorating industrial situation as the war expanded to multiple fronts, made it impossible to field effective equipment in meaningful numbers. The Luftwaffe was being asked to fight a 1943-level technological war with 1940-level equipment, and the gap was only widening. Some Luftwaffe units tried tactical countermeasures that didn't require advanced technology. Flying at extremely low altitude, where radar detection was more difficult due to ground clutter, was attempted but came with its own severe dangers. Navigation became much harder, fuel consumption increased dramatically, and the risk of flying into terrain or obstacles was substantial. Some crews tried flying deliberately evasive courses with random altitude and heading changes, but this increased flight time, consumed more fuel, and made accurate navigation to targets nearly impossible. Experiments with chaff, strips of metal foil dropped to confuse radar returns, showed some promise, but producing it in sufficient quantities and developing effective deployment techniques would take time Germany didn't have. By 1942, the Luftwaffe was also contending with deteriorating fuel supplies, the demands of the Eastern Front, and the need to defend German airspace against an expanding Allied bomber offensive. Resources that might have gone to developing night bombing countermeasures were diverted elsewhere. The fundamental problem was that Germany had completely lost the initiative in electronic warfare and lacked the industrial capacity to regain it while simultaneously fighting a multi-front war. British radar technology continued to advance. Improved AI-Mk8 radar with better range and resolution appeared. The superb de Havilland Mosquito entered service as an even more capable radar-equipped night fighter, and sophisticated ground control systems coordinated the defense. By 1943, the Luftwaffe had effectively conceded the night sky over Britain, abandoning the strategic bombing campaign that had once seemed so promising. The dream of bringing Britain to its knees through aerial terror had died, killed by a technology German commanders had fatally and arrogantly underestimated. By mid-1943, the transformation of the night war was complete and dramatic. The night sky over Britain, once terrorized by waves of German bombers dropping tons of high explosives and incendiaries, had become a hunting ground where British radar-equipped fighters reigned supreme. The introduction of the de Havilland Mosquito night fighter, with its improved AI-Mk8 radar, superior speed, and excellent handling characteristics, made interceptions even more lethal and routine. This wooden wonder could catch any German bomber with ease and carried devastating firepower. British night fighter crews had evolved from desperate defenders into confident, skilled predators. Their tactics had been refined through hundreds of successful engagements, and the integration of airborne radar into their operations was now seamless. Pilots like John "Cat's Eyes" Cunningham, whose nickname deliberately concealed the radar technology behind British success, became national heroes. Their kill tallies mounted steadily as they mastered the art of radar-directed night fighting, and their success rates climbed to levels that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The technology that had seemed almost like science fiction in 1940 was now routine and reliable. Improved radar sets were more dependable, with better range and resolution. Ground control stations could vector night fighters to the right area with great precision, and then the airborne radar took over for the final intercept. The system worked with mechanical efficiency. German bombers detected, fighters scrambled, radar-guided interceptions executed, bombers destroyed. Night after night, the deadly routine continued. German night operations over Britain had effectively ceased by this point, the losses too catastrophic to sustain or justify. On the rare occasions when Luftwaffe bombers did venture into British airspace after dark, usually on special operations or reconnaissance missions, they did so knowing their chances of survival were poor. The psychological victory was as important as the tactical one. Britain's cities could rest easier, their citizens no longer subjected to nightly terror raids. The air raid sirens that had been such a constant presence fell mostly silent. The same radar technology that had saved Britain was now being applied in other theaters with similarly decisive results. Over Germany itself, RAF Bomber Command employed radar-equipped Mosquito night fighters to protect its bomber streams from German night fighters, turning the tables completely. In the Mediterranean, radar-equipped aircraft hunted Axis shipping and submarines. The night had indeed changed ownership, and with it, the entire strategic balance of the air war had shifted decisively and permanently in Britain's favour. The hunters had become the hunted, and German commanders had learned, far too late, the cost of underestimating revolutionary technology. The abandonment of Germany's night bombing campaign against Britain represented far more than just a tactical defeat. It was a strategic catastrophe with far-reaching consequences that rippled through the Luftwaffe and German war planning. The Luftwaffe had invested enormous resources in building and maintaining its bomber fleet, resources that could never be recovered. Thousands of aircrew had been trained at great expense in time, fuel, and training aircraft. Strategic doctrine had been built around the assumption that German bombers could strike enemy cities and industries regardless of daylight air superiority. When British radar technology made night operations over Britain effectively suicidal, all of that investment became essentially worthless. The bomber units couldn't simply be converted to other roles. The aircraft were unsuited for daylight operations where British fighters dominated completely, and retraining crews for different missions would take time Germany didn't have. Many bomber units were simply disbanded or relegated to secondary theaters where the opposition was less formidable, a waste of capability that Germany's strained military could ill afford. The psychological impact on the Luftwaffe as an institution was profound and demoralizing. A service that had once seen itself as invincible, that had crushed opposition across Europe with apparent ease, had been decisively defeated by an enemy technology it had arrogantly dismissed as insignificant. The lesson was not lost on German military planners. Technological advantage could matter more than courage or tactical skill, and underestimating enemy innovations could prove fatal. The broader implications of Germany's radar defeat extended far beyond the night bombing campaign. By 1943, Allied radar technology was dominating across multiple domains. Radar-equipped aircraft were decimating German U-boats, finding them on the surface at night and attacking before they could dive. Radar-directed anti-aircraft fire was downing German bombers over Germany itself with increasing effectiveness. Radar-guided night fighters were savaging Luftwaffe night fighter forces attempting to defend against RAF Bomber Command. The entire electronic warfare dimension of the conflict had been ceded to the Allies because of early dismissiveness and later inability to catch up technologically. German airfields that had once bustled with bomber activity preparing for night missions over Britain sat eerily quiet, their aircraft reassigned to other theaters or simply grounded due to lack of fuel and spare parts. The strategic bombing campaign that Hitler and Goering had believed would bring Britain to its knees, breaking civilian morale and industrial capacity, had instead collapsed utterly under the weight of underestimated British technology and determination. Germany had lost the night, and with it, a crucial component of its strategic air war. The night air battle over Britain between 1940 and 1943 stands as one of history's clearest demonstrations of how technological innovation can completely and rapidly transform the nature of warfare. What began with British scientists experimenting with radio waves at a coastal research facility ended with a revolution in aerial combat that fundamentally changed military aviation forever. The primitive, temperamental radar sets that were installed in Beaufighters in 1940, equipment that weighed hundreds of pounds, required constant maintenance, and had a range measured in single-digit miles, were the ancestors of systems that now routinely track targets across hundreds of miles. Every modern military aircraft, from fighters to bombers to transport planes, carries sophisticated radar systems descended directly from those pioneering sets. The principle remains fundamentally the same, using electromagnetic radiation to detect, track, and in many cases target enemy aircraft. But the technology has evolved beyond anything those pioneering radar operators could have imagined. Modern systems can track hundreds of targets simultaneously, discriminate between aircraft types, see through weather and countermeasures, and do so at ranges that would have seemed like magic to World War II crews. The lessons from Britain's radar victory resonate through military planning and doctrine to this day. Germany's dismissal of radar's potential serves as a cautionary tale studied in military academies worldwide, demonstrating the dangers of technological arrogance and the critical importance of taking enemy innovations seriously, even when they seem improbable or unlikely. Intelligence failures, wishful thinking, and underestimation of enemy capabilities can prove catastrophically costly, as German bomber crews learned to their sorrow. Britain's systematic development and application of radar technology, conversely, demonstrates the immense value of investing in research and development even during peacetime, of maintaining technological advantage through innovation, and of integrating new capabilities into operational doctrine quickly and effectively. The British didn't just invent radar, they weaponized it, trained crews to use it, developed tactics around it, and deployed it operationally faster than their enemies could respond. That institutional agility and commitment to technological warfare paid enormous dividends. The night fighter crews who learned to use those first primitive radar sets pioneered techniques and procedures that form the foundation of modern aerial intercept tactics. The concept of the two-person crew with a dedicated sensor operator, the procedures for ground-controlled intercepts, the tactics for radar-guided approaches and attacks, all of these were developed under combat conditions over the night skies of Britain and remain relevant today. The German commanders who underestimated radar learned their lesson too late, at a cost measured in thousands of lost aircraft, tens of thousands of casualties, and a strategic campaign that failed utterly. The British, who bet heavily on science, innovation, and the intelligent application of technology, gained mastery of the night sky and with it, a crucial advantage in the long struggle for ultimate victory.